Joining me now on set is Dr. Robert Lanza, Medical Director and Vice President of Medical and Scientific Development at Advanced Cell Technology. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
The long-awaited statement by the President was finally made, of course. How much will this affect your work?
Well, we're of course very pleased. We believe that this represents a milestone in medical history and that it could spur a medical revolution as important as antibiotics and vaccines. But that having been said, we're of course very disappointed with the number of stem cell lines that the President is allowing for this research. We of course would have liked to have seen more. Obviously we're all wondering where these 60 cell lines are.
What do you mean you're wondering where they are?
Well, all of us have been battering our brains trying to figure out where they are. I mean, virtually all of the experts have come together and we've added up the total number that we can discern here in the United States. And to the best of our ability, there are perhaps 17. We know that between Huron and Wisconsin that there are probably maybe 11 or 12.
I think the number that he was talking about was 60 was worldwide.
Right, exactly. So we figure in the United States perhaps about 17. We figure in Israel there are 4.
So are you saying then that there just simply aren't enough to go around for the research that's needed?
Well, we're saying we can't even account for 30 of them. So we're only guessing the only other country left is India. So maybe the majority of them are there. But in terms of all of the labs that we recognize as being the leaders in the field, we cannot even account for 30 of these. So obviously they're there somewhere, but we just don't know.
Don't know. What kind of numbers would be needed for the sort of research that your company and others would like to do?
Well, the first thing to remember here is 60 is very deceptive. First of all, a large majority of those, we don't know their history. We don't even know if they're of any value, for instance, how hardy they are, for instance. All stem cell lines are not the same. We know that, for instance, in many cases, they just grow so slowly that they're practically worthless. Other cell lines have very little plasticity, and by that we mean they are not able to become this or that cell type. And even a certain cell line varies from passage to passage. That means as you continue to grow that cell, it has less ability to differentiate into the cell types that we want. So again, although these cells technically are immortal, they really only have a viable lifespan of maybe a year or 2.
So do you think the President was just trying to skirt around this issue then by referring to these lines and saying this is enough and all we need to do?
So to speak, yes. We think it's a very, very important first step. We think that Congress is going to look at this very carefully. I think that there are a lot of senators who feel that we need more of these and that we're really going to be crippled in our fight here to come up with the optimal therapies. It's sort of like going into battle with one arm tied behind your back, and it's certainly not the way we're used to doing science.
But your company now is involved in the cloning of embryos. Correct?
Yes, I think that, people are starting to understand the enormous value of embryonic stem cells, and they know that the hope is to turn, for instance, these cells into heart cells, so we could fix your heart if your heart is damaged, or into insulin-producing cells if you have diabetes, or neurons if you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. But people haven't stopped to think, what's the next step? You can't just plunk these into the body. Your body will reject them. And I've been in transplant immunology for 20 years, and I can tell you, when I started with Chris Barnard doing heart transplants 20 years ago, the drug we were using was cyclosporin, and here we are 20 years later, it's still the drug of choice, and we might be here another 20 years. So you can't just give a person, say, insulin-producing cells without immunosuppression, because if you do, immunosuppression can form cancer, cause cancer, infection, and that's a case where the cure is worse than the disease. So the only way we can do that now is through cloning, therapeutic cloning. And what we would do, for instance, is take one of your skin cells and then turn it back in time using an oocyte or an egg cell, and then those cells would be your own. So we could then just inject them back into your body and you would be cured.
But the problem in there for a lot of people is using that oocyte that is made from cloning. That a lot of people are, who even advocates who believe that we should be involved in the stem cell research, they think that taking that extra step is a dangerous extra step because it begins us on a slippery slope.
Sure, absolutely. It's the whole question of whether a completely undifferentiated ball of cells that's microscopic, that is smaller than the tip of a pin, warrants the same rights and reverence as an adult, say a child or a parent that may die because we fail to move the moral line. And many senators, I think, have been saying that life really begins in a woman's uterus, in a womb, not in a test tube or a Petri dish. And when I was in medical school, we always learned that the first trace of the embryo is the primitive streak. That doesn't occur until implantation. Prior to that time, there's not even a single body cell. So we're talking about a tiny little ball of cells that's like a dot.
You may be talking about that, but a lot of other people are now talking about human cloning, and about the ability to make a human being.
Yes.
And the president referred to that in his speech by talking certainly against human cloning,
yes.
but also saying that this was tied up in that.
Well, you know, we obviously all agree, all of the scientists, all of the politicians, we all agree that cloning identical copies of human beings is not only unethical and immoral, but it's not safe scientifically. So we're all in agreement there.
But not everyone is, because some people are trying to do it.
Well, there are a few fringe groups, you know, that are always out there, but I don't think any reputable scientist would seriously consider, you know, making, 1,000 copies of Dolly Parton or Michael Jordan. No one wants to see that. I think what we're talking about simply doing here is the fact that there's a very real human tragedy out there. This isn't academic. I mean, anyone, Nancy Reagan, for instance, who has lived with Ronald Reagan with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or anyone who is a loved one and watches children with diabetes go blind or have their limbs amputated, to know that a mother could just donate one of her oocytes and alleviate that suffering from that child for the rest of their life. That's what we're talking about.
There's no doubt that this has an incredible lure to it, and a lot of people look at those diseases and look at the possibility of those cures, because we don't know right now that that's absolutely possible, and say that is a wonderful thing. But how would you go about making those embryos, about cloning those embryos? Where do those come from?
Okay, well, first of all, you know, there's a few things here that I think should be pointed out. One is you know, I'm a scientist, and on the one hand, you know, we are concerned about when life begins. But the government should really be in here to protect the health and well-being of the population. It shouldn't really be trying to get into taking sides whether one religious view is superior
but let's back
than
up and
another.
get back to my question.
Okay.
Where do these embryos come from? How do you clone them? How do you make them? Where does the, you know, do women donate them? What happens?
Yeah, what we would do is say, you know, you had a patient who had Parkinson's disease. We would just take a skin cell or a cheek cell, and then what we do is we put that next to an empty egg cell, and that empty egg cell could be donated from, say, a family member, a mother for her child, or even an anonymous donor. And then what you do is you take the cell from the patient, put it next to one of these empty egg cells, send a little electrical charge, and what happens is the two cells fuse. The DNA from the donated cell goes into the empty egg, and then what it does is it starts to divide, and after a few cleavage divisions, you have this microscopic ball of cells that's just hollow. And most of those cells, in any case, even if it did go on to become a child, would be discarded in the form of the placenta. But you have this tiny microscopic ball of cells that's going to be implanted. But prior to that time, if you take some of those cells, they will grow indefinitely in a Petri dish, and we are able, by using different chemicals, to turn them, say, into beating heart cells. Or we have whole dishes, for instance, of dopaminergic neurons that could be used to cure Parkinson's disease.
How much will your work then be affected by what has been deemed by the president to be the way that we proceed, and also in Congress where they're talking about banning human cloning? Now, I understand that is many steps hence from what you're doing, but how will you be affected by those things?
Well, on the first hand, the fact that we're going to be able to proceed now with all of the creative talent of the entire U.S. biomedical community is extremely important, because up until now, our collaborations, for instance, with Harvard and the Mayo Clinic have been limited to animal cells because they cannot use the human cells. So again, by being able to tap into that enormous creativity, into, you know, all the scholars here at MIT, you know, in Harvard, I think is very, very important. On the other hand, as soon as we develop these therapies, we already know how to produce some insulin-producing cells. We already know how to get those dopaminergic neurons. But what are we going to do with them? I mean, if you're going to use these in any clinically useful way, in any way that's going to help someone, you've got to put them back into the body without rejection. And I don't think that the public quite understands the next step in the problem. The first problem is getting the cells, but you can't use those.
So how do those decisions that have just been made affect your ability to get those cells and to go forward?
Yeah, I think it's going to help us get those cells. So then in that sense, it's great. But on the other hand, I think that, you know, Congress is obviously going to have to consider the next step. You know, how are we going to get cells that we can do something with in a way that will help people who have these diseases?
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with more in just a moment. News Night coming up. We'll look at the road ahead, the world of stem cell research after President Bush puts his policy in place next. Back now talking about stem cell research. The president in his recent speech on this subject said that while we must devote enormous energy to conquering disease, it is equally important that we pay attention to the moral concerns raised by the new frontier of human embryo stem cell research. Even the most noble ends do not justify the means. Does that give you any chilling effect of your work in cloning human embryos for this work, for the stem cell research? Certainly, he clearly defined where federal funding will go, and that would not be to your work.
Right.
How do you fund your work going forward, and could you see yourself moving out of the United States if necessary?
Well, you know, obviously we're very optimistic that the Senate is going to listen to this very carefully. I think that they're going to consider, you know, all the details here. They're not going to rush something through like, as they did in the House with a few hours of debate. And we're very optimistic, and the signals that we're hearing so far is that they are supportive of the work we're doing. So that being said, I think that we're going to be able to proceed. If for some reason they say, you know, we can't do it here in the United States, I think at that point we're going to have to consider what our options are. I think we'd very much like to stay here, of course. You know.
Where would you go, if necessary?
Well, obviously, Great Britain, the Parliament has overwhelmingly supported this research. So obviously this work is not only allowed, but actually, you know, something that they really are thinking of as the frontier of medicine.
Do you think that people unjustifiably draw that line between, you know, the cloning of embryos for this work or embryos created through infertility clinics that have been discarded or unused by couples?
Well, I think, you know, using embryonic stem cell lines derived from embryos that will be thrown away, I think that that's certainly the way to start this work. I mean, certainly those are stem cell lines that we can work with.
What kind of a supply is there? Is that a large number?
Oh, yes. We estimate there are at least 100,000 embryos that are frozen away that will merely be discarded. So I think that in terms of the basic research to work out these technologies, I think that that's adequate. There's absolutely no reason to create an embryo to generate embryonic stem cell lines. These already exist. What we're talking about now is how are we going to actually derive the benefits from all of these therapies that we're going to develop. We're going to have insulin-producing cells that we could now inject into a patient to cure them. And in that particular situation, you can't just do that. We've tried this hundreds of times in patients, and even with a cocktail of immunosuppressive drugs, you can't do that. So what we're proposing is that once we develop these therapies, we know that they work in animals. Say you have a child who has diabetes. You know, certainly you're not going to subject that child to a lifetime regimen of immunosuppression, particularly when they have decades of good quality life. You want to be able to just inject those cells and have that child be cured for the rest of their life. And the way we would do that is, say, for instance, the mother would just donate an oocyte, and we would create some of these cells. They would get the injection, and that child would be able to live without having to worry about going blind, having kidney failure, you know, heart attacks, limbs amputated. I mean, again, we think that this is a pretty straightforward decision. Medically speaking, it's entirely consistent with the ethical goals of medicine, healing, the prevention of disease, and research to alleviate pain and suffering. And you know, I feel a medical obligation to do whatever we can here to help people, and I think that many religions, Judaism, they have an obligation to heal as well. So.
Have you gotten a lot of heat, though, from your work? A lot of people have been sort of backing out of this research, and there haven't been as many young scientists and doctors going in.
It's a tough decision. You know, it's very, very tough. You know, I had to think very carefully before doing this, but I mean, again, you know, I've spent my entire life trying to figure out how to get these cells back into patients, how to transplant these without the rejection. And, you know, we've been batting our brain, and every few years we say, oh, we're going to come up with a new generation of drugs without side effects, or we're going to figure out, you know, transplant, you know, tolerance, all of these things. But again, you know, we're here 20 years later, we still don't have those solutions, and what's going to happen, you know, when we have these therapies?
So medicine is a business like anything else. Will you get your funding then from drug companies, from private sources, and then do they have a patent on that work? Is that how this goes forward?
Well, I think the basic research, we actually have some government grants online at this point, but obviously it'll be private funding, individuals, you know, corporate monies.
A lot of people are worried about the rules that go along with this, and that's one reason they were happy and relieved, I think, about the government stepping in to some degree. Who makes up your rules? And do you have a bioethical panel, or what happens?
Yes, actually, we have an ethics board that consists of some of the world-renowned bioethicists. You know, Ron Green, for instance, who is the chairman of the Department of Religion at Dartmouth. He is the director of the Board of Ethics. And they sit down and they basically go through all the experiments that we do very, very carefully. And I can honestly say at this point that we have followed every single one of their recommendations.
And where does this stop? Where do they draw the line then on where this research can go or not go?
Well, I think that they feel very much the same as we do, and that is that this medical research should continue in terms of helping people who are suffering from diseases. Again, we're all in agreement that this should not be used in any way to make an identical copy of a person, not to clone, say, you or I.
All right. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Very informative. Dr. Robert Lanza.